In the winter of 1556, nearly 830,000 people died in just a few minutes. This is the deadliest earthquake in recorded human history, and it happened in a place that even many Chinese people today have never heard of. The death toll exceeded the entire current population of San Francisco, all in a single cold January night. How could a region lose nearly 60% of its population in just minutes? And what made this earthquake different from everything that came before? To understand this, we need to go back to a unique region of China, where nature had created a type of home unlike anywhere else on Earth. The Loess Plateau of Shaanxi Province is made of a special material called loess, a fine dust that accumulated over millions of years from Central Asian sandstorms. This soil is remarkable, soft enough to carve by hand, yet firm enough to form self-supporting walls without any structural framework. The people of Shaanxi had been living in these cave dwellings called yaodong for thousands of years, and by the 16th century, millions of people called them home. Inside, these cave homes stayed warm in winter, cool in summer, and many families considered them the safest shelter they could possibly have. But beneath their feet, along the Wei River fault zone, running east-west across the entire province, geological pressure had been building for centuries. The Wei River fault is one of the most seismically active zones in China, where the Indian plate pushes northward, compressing Central Asian terrain millimeter by millimeter every year. The night of January 23rd, 1556, was dark and cold, like any other winter night in Shaanxi. Most people were asleep on their warm kang beds, while children curled up beneath thick cotton quilts. It was around midnight, or perhaps 1 to 2 in the morning, when the ground began shaking in a way none of them had ever experienced. Historians estimate this earthquake reached approximately 8.2 to 8.3 magnitude, roughly 10 times more powerful than the 2011 Japan earthquake. But raw magnitude is only part of the story, because what happened next was determined by a factor nobody had considered: the type of soil everyone was living inside. Loess has one fatal weakness. When subjected to strong vibration, it does not merely crack, but liquefies, transforming from solid earth into flowing mud within seconds. The 1-meter-thick yaodong walls that had protected millions across centuries suddenly became multi-ton traps, collapsing onto sleeping people. At the same moment, in flatter areas, the wooden and brick buildings of Xi'an and Weinan were enduring forces they had never been designed to withstand. The Big Wild Goose Pagoda in Xi'an, the famous Buddhist monument built in 648, survived but cracked and tilted during the violent shaking that night. But the true catastrophe did not come from city buildings. It came from the surrounding hills, as tens of millions of tons of loess began sliding downward. In Shaanxi Province alone, and neighboring provinces like Henan and Shaanxi, the earth and hills moved in ways that even survivors could not find words to describe. Scientists today, drawing on historical records and geological surveys, estimate shaking intensity in the worst affected areas reached modified Mercalli intensity XI, a level at which virtually no structure can survive. What does that mean in practice? Buildings were not merely cracking, they were being thrown into the air or completely crushed by the seismic waves passing through. Particularly dangerous were areas near the Wei River, where soft, saturated soil caused seismic wave amplification many times greater than on hard ground. When the soil beneath a village liquefied, the entire village did not collapse, but sank, slowly swallowed by the ground, turning to mud beneath it. Simultaneously, on the high-low slopes, hundreds of landslides occurred at once, each burying villages below under 3 to 50 meters of earth. Imagine this. Some of the larger landslides moved at 50 to 100 kilometers per hour, fast enough that no one could outrun them. Some massive landslides created natural dams, blocking rivers, causing sudden water level rises that flooded tens of additional square kilometers of lowland downstream. The shaking did not stop after the first strike. Powerful aftershocks continued for weeks, each one bringing down whatever had survived the initial earthquake. Notably, the larger aftershocks were strong enough to trigger fresh landslides on slopes already weakened by the initial earthquake, creating a domino effect across the region. The Wei River and its tributaries became clogged with tons of mud and earthen debris, turning familiar waterways into thick, slow-moving streams of brown-yellow sludge. And then there was a phenomenon that few people know about. In many areas, the ground surface naturally rose or dropped by several meters after the earthquake, permanently changing the shape of an entire region. By dawn, when the first light fell on Shaanxi, what had been one of China's most densely populated agricultural regions looked as though it had been pulled apart from within. Now, let us talk about the number that makes this earthquake stand alone in human history: 830,000 people dead. To feel the scale of this, if you read each person's name aloud at 3 seconds per name, you would need 86 consecutive days without rest just to finish reading them all. Those 830,000 people represented approximately 60% of the entire affected region's population, meaning in every 10 households, 6 had lost everyone inside. More than 104 counties across an area of approximately 1 million square kilometers were affected, spanning 8 provinces of Ming Dynasty China. To put this in perspective, the entire affected area was larger than the combined territory of France and Germany. A lesser-known detail from Ming Dynasty chronicles records that, in some areas, the ground split open and swallowed groups of people attempting to flee. Those chronicles also recorded that in some hillside villages, everything, trees, buildings, and the very ground itself, was suddenly thrown into the air and landed in a different location. These accounts were once dismissed by Western historians until modern geologists confirmed that strong earthquakes on loess terrain can produce a vertical ejection effect known as the vertical throwing effect. A third factor driving the catastrophic death toll was timing. The deep middle of a winter night, when the entire population was asleep inside the most collapse-prone structures humans had ever built. For comparison, the 2015 Nepal earthquake reached 7.8 magnitude, but killed only 9,000 people, a fraction of Shaanxi, because housing construction and population density were different. Now let us talk about what happened to those who survived that night, because their story was no less tragic than those who died. The winter of 1556 was particularly cold in Shaanxi, and homeless survivors faced temperatures potentially dropping to -10 to -15 degrees Celsius without any shelter. Major trade and transport routes between provinces were completely blocked by landslides, meaning no food, clean water, or any form of relief could arrive for many days. Drinking water sources were severely contaminated by animal carcasses and debris, and disease began spreading in the months following the earthquake. Some scholars estimate that deaths from disease and famine in the following year may have reached tens of thousands more. Beyond the initial 830,000, the city of Xi'an, the administrative and economic center of the region, suffered heavy damage but was not obliterated, as it sat on firmer ground and was approximately 100 kilometers from the epicenter. But for the villages closer to the epicenter, such as Huaiyan and Chaoyi counties, there was nothing left to return to. The Ming Dynasty historian Qin Keke recorded that mountains and valleys changed position, rivers and streams changed their courses, and even the roads between cities vanished completely. Ming court records also documented that some areas of land rose up to 20 meters, while others subsided by tens of meters. Meanwhile, the first survivors began digging with bare hands through the Loess mounds. But winter-wet Loess can weigh more than 2 tons per cubic meter. A cruel reality of Loess is that it leaves no void space when it collapses. Unlike concrete collapse, which creates survival cavities, Loess fills every space immediately. This is why the survival rate for those buried inside collapsed yaodong was nearly zero, and why survivors were predominantly those who happened to be outside when the earthquake struck. But there were also remarkable survival stories. Some people were found alive, protected by the solid kang bed, by a wooden beam that fell in the right direction, or simply by their random position inside the cave. Survival was often a matter of a few centimeters, a direction of tilt, or someone getting up for a drink of water at midnight, never knowing that exact moment had saved their life. Surviving local officials attempted to organize relief, but the scale of the catastrophe exceeded any response system the Ming Dynasty court could mobilize. Information about the catastrophe took 10 to 14 days to reach the capital Beijing, where the Jiajing Emperor reigned, as the entire Ming courier horse relay system was paralyzed by landslides. When the news finally reached Beijing, even the most experienced officials could not believe what they were reading, because there was no historical precedent to compare it to. The Ming Dynasty court responded by exempting the affected region from taxes for multiple years, dispatching grain from national stockpiles, and appointing special reconstruction officials, but truly rebuilding a region that had lost nearly 60% of its population was not merely a material problem. It was a social and psychological wound deeper than anyone at court could imagine. The population of Shaanxi Province did not recover to pre-earthquake levels until nearly 200 years later, well into the 18th century. But there is a lesser-known detail about the aftermath of 1556. It changed the culture and religion of an entire region in ways that researchers are only beginning to understand. Many scholars and monks recorded that survivors sought understanding of why the disaster had happened, driving the growth of new philosophical and religious movements in Shaanxi during the 16th and 17th centuries. Among the most remarkable was the famous treatise of scholar Qin Keke, who analyzed the earthquake based on direct observation and made evacuation recommendations that we now know to be correct. Qin Keke wrote that when an earthquake strikes, one should not run outside, but instead sit down and hold onto a fixed object, because the shaking ground causes people to fall and be injured while attempting to flee. These recommendations by Qin Keke were written in 1556, but are still cited by modern seismologists as the earliest and most accurate observations on safe earthquake behavior. A lesser discussed long-term geological consequence is that the 1556 earthquake permanently altered the drainage system of the Loess Plateau, affecting the region's agriculture and water supply for centuries. Loess sediment from the millions of 1556 landslides poured into the Wei and Yellow rivers, causing a spike in the Yellow River's sediment load and accelerating deposition in the downstream lowlands. This is the lesson we need to understand about disasters at this scale. The consequences do not end when the shaking stops. They spread through space and time in ways nobody could anticipate. The next question is, what has changed in how we understand and respond to earthquakes since the 1556 Shaanxi earthquake? First, we developed a global seismic monitoring network. Today, more than 8,000 seismic stations worldwide continuously record every tremor above magnitude 1.0. China, learning from tragedies like 1556 Shaanxi and 1976 Tangshan, now operates more than 1,000 dedicated seismic stations across its territory. Second, we have come to understand that the location of a structure on soft soil versus bedrock determines its survival more than any other design factor. This is why all modern building codes in China, Japan, and the United States require mandatory geological site surveys before constructing any significant structure in seismic zones. Third, the 1556 Shaanxi earthquake is the first earthquake in history documented in sufficient detail for modern seismologists to reconstruct both the fault mechanism and damage distribution. The specific and detailed records left by Ming Dynasty scholars including descriptions of building tilt directions, soil types, and damage distribution, have become invaluable scientific data for modern seismology. But what is truly remarkable is that even with all modern technology, we still cannot accurately predict when and where the next major earthquake will strike. The tectonic plate beneath Shaanxi Province is still moving today at several millimeters per year, accumulating stress in ways scientists can measure but cannot precisely predict to breaking point. The area of the 1556 epicenter now belongs to modern Shaanxi Province, home to more than 38 million people, many times the total population affected 470 years ago. This is not a detail raised to cause alarm, but to remind us that geology is not history. It is the present unfolding before us. After the 2008 Sichuan earthquake, when 225,000 people died, China rebuilt its entire seismic resistance standard system with far stricter requirements. China's earthquake early warning system, completed in 2022, can now deliver alerts to mobile phones within 5 to 20 seconds before destructive seismic waves arrive. 20 seconds sounds short, but 20 seconds is enough to turn off a gas stove, enough to get under a desk, enough for a high-speed train to brake in an emergency, and enough to pause a surgical operation. But this technology only has value if people know what to do in those 20 seconds. And that is why disaster education is the single most important protective factor any society can invest in. Japan, the country most affected by earthquakes worldwide, has developed a disaster preparedness culture so deep that every household maintains an emergency kit and every building has national regulation evacuation signs. The paradox of large-scale disasters is that we learn the most from the most catastrophic ones, because only the largest failures create the social pressure strong enough to change policy and behavior. This is why the 1556 Shaanxi earthquake, though it occurred nearly 500 years ago, is still studied and cited by scientists, engineers, and policymakers to this day. This leads us to the final and perhaps most important question. If an equivalent earthquake happened in Shaanxi today, with all the technology and warning systems we have, how different would the outcome be? The answer is complex. Modern technology would save millions through early warning, earthquake-resistant buildings, and faster relief response. But the much higher population density also means overall risk is greater. This is why scientists cannot simply say, "We are much safer than the people of Shaanxi in 1556, only that we are better prepared and better informed." There is one final thing about the 1556 Shaanxi earthquake I want you to remember after this video. It is the disaster that proved how people build their homes matters more than where they live. 830,000 people in 1556 did not die because they lived in an earthquake zone. They died because they lived in structures not designed to withstand the forces the ground beneath them could generate. And this is what we can control. We cannot move tectonic plates, we cannot switch off geological faults, but we can decide how we build and where we build. The 1556 Shaanxi earthquake also reminds us of something else. Poorer and less prepared societies always suffer far heavier consequences from the same disaster than wealthy and well-prepared ones. That means disaster resilience is not merely a technical problem, it is a question of social equity. When a society fails to invest in infrastructure protecting its people, disasters will make that choice for them. Looking back at the night of January 23, 1556 in Shaanxi, what haunts me most is not the number 820,000, but the question, how many of them might have survived if we had known what we know today? The answer is, a great many people, perhaps the majority, because most of the causes of death are things we now understand clearly and know how to prevent. This does not erase the tragedy of 1556. It cannot be erased. But it shows us that the knowledge we accumulated from those disasters is not meaningless. The 1556 Shaanxi earthquake took 830,000 lives, but it also left us one of the most valuable historical records of natural disaster and human response ever documented. Each time a seismologist opens those records to understand fault mechanisms, each time an engineer reads Chin-Keka's observations to improve building standards, those who died continue protecting the living. And perhaps this is the true legacy of great disasters. They do not disappear, they become part of humanity's collective knowledge, the only thing that can grow larger and more enduring than the disaster itself. The land of Shaanxi today continues to flourish. New cities grow. People are born and build homes, just as they did for 1,000 years before the earthquake and for 1,000 years after it. This is the thing about people that even the greatest disasters cannot change. We rebuild, we learn, and we try to ensure that those who come after us will not have to pay the price for lessons we already learned. If you have watched this far, you have just learned something that very few people know, that the deadliest earthquake in history did not happen where we might imagine, and it taught us lessons we are still learning. The 1556 Shaanxi earthquake began with a cold winter night and ended by permanently changing an entire landscape, an entire culture, and the way humanity thinks about the fragility of the places we call home. The ground beneath Shaanxi is moving right now, at a pace none of us can feel, accumulating stress toward a day we cannot predict, but which will certainly come. The question is not whether that will happen, but when it does, whether we will be the people who learned enough from the night of January 23rd, 1556, the largest earthquake never measured by a seismograph, the deadliest earthquake in recorded history, the earthquake whose 16th century scholar wrote survival advice we still use today, all from one winter night in a land most of us had never heard of 470 years ago. If you found this video fascinating, continue with other great disasters in human history that we have explored in this series, because every natural disaster has an amazing scientific story hidden behind it. And if there is one single thing you remember from this video, remember this: the ground you are standing on has a history longer than any history you have ever read, and sometimes it reminds us of that.